Ann Jones is a writer and photographer whose work is focused on violence and its consequences, both at home and abroad. She has reported on the impact of war on both civilians and soldiers, and her work has appeared in The Nation, online at tomdispatch.com, and in 10 books of nonfiction. She joins us tonight with her latest title, They Were Soldiers: How the Wounded Return from America's Wars, The Untold Story, an examination of the great hidden costs of the US wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, the soldiers who have returned suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder, and the way they struggle with the enormous psychological toll that can come from trauma. So please give a warm welcome to Ann Jones.
Thank you all for being here, and I want to thank Town Hall and Elliott Bay Books for inviting me and selling books and generally supporting this cause, and the Veterans for Peace and Coffee Strong folks out here in the lobby who have a lot of information about their efforts, which have been going on year after year after year after year to try to stop the militarization of this country and the wars, and they are extremely deserving of your support and backing. We don't have a whole lot of time, and I want to leave a lot of time for you folks to have a say. So, and I tend to be very long-winded, so I'll try to go fast. But I want to give you an idea of what's in this book and read a little bit of it to you, and then I'll turn it over to you. This book is dedicated to my father, who I'm finally making my peace with him, who was a very highly decorated soldier in World War I. So it was almost 100 years ago that my father received the physical and psychological injuries that made him a highly decorated hero and that brought him home as a hero, and he turned into a successful small-town businessman, very highly respected in our community, known as a wonderful, affable, good-humored, generous guy. Everybody loved him. He was a success story of a vet who had come home from the war better than he left for it, you know. Not true. All of that was true of him in public, but at home in private, he was a very unhappy and violent man. And I grew up in that violent household, so I have never believed the statistics that the Pentagon keeps rolling out about how it's only a small fraction of our returning vets who have any real troubles that we should be concerned about. And now, of course, we have a recent report from a group of major universities funded by the Pentagon, which has concluded that all of these soldiers who are suffering from problems of our last two wars are actually suffering from pre-existing conditions. Where have you heard that before? I mention this about my father to stress the fact that a wounded war veteran is not an individual case. Every wound resonates in the family, in the community, and down through the years. And 100 years from now, if the planet lasts that long, somebody's going to be standing up here probably saying about these wars what I've been saying about my father and the consequences of World War I. So, things to keep in mind. Let's go to Afghanistan. The base stands in a shallow valley amid steep mountains on the northeastern margin of Afghanistan. It is laid out in a tidy grid behind walls of concrete and gigantic HESCO bags of steel wire mesh filled with rocks and rubble. It is June 2010. And every morning the gate opens to release into the high stony desert a convoy of MRAPs, mine-resistant, ambush-protected armored vehicles on patrol. Incidentally, those vehicles cost $1 million apiece, and they're now being destroyed in Afghanistan because it's cheaper than bringing them home, and that way the defense contractors get to make a whole new round of them. Tall and top-heavy, an MRAP is apt to roll down a mountainside, leaving soldiers to crawl out and make their way back to base on foot through a landscape laced with mines and overseen by enemy snipers. Often, a patrol does not end well. One day, the base commander goes to the gate to meet vehicles returning from an ambushed patrol. The MRAPs creep slowly in and park in a row just off the main intersection. And there the soldiers sit in the vehicles until day turns nearly to dark. Other soldiers walk restlessly up and down the street, but none of them intrude upon the squad in the MRAPs, knowing they have lost a man and earned the right to sit there, still strapped in, doing whatever it is they feel they must do. The next day I watch a sergeant mount a color photo of the newly dead soldier in a black frame. He holds it at arm's length. A boy's slightly blurred face, squeezed between a high dress collar and an oversized hat, looks back at us from the shadow of the brim. The sergeant says, "It's too bad it's not a better photograph." After checking the spelling of the soldier's name, he hangs the photo on the wall in the corridor outside the base commander's office, at the end of a long row of similar photographs. Such photos, taken as a soldier's military career begins, are on file when needed for just such occasions as this. Thousands of these photographs stand forever on dressers or mantelpieces in the homes of parents who try to look past the uniform and the hat to find the boy or girl who once was their child. A lot of these soldiers are just children, kids. I learned that from an orthopedic surgeon at Bagram Base who said to me, he must have been about 35 years old himself. He was a career military orthopedic surgeon, and he said, you know, I am a career military man, and I try to look at these people as military, but when they're on the operating table, I have to see they're just kids. So what kind of kids are these? American kids, especially boys, dream the dreams of a militarized nation steeped in war, the only advanced nation always looking for a fight. One veteran of Iraq describes his American childhood this way: "As a young boy growing up, I remember playing Army with my brother and my friends for hours upon hours, days at a time. It seems as though in our country, kids grow up with a gun in their hands. Either that or watching movies and playing video games involving deadly weapons and killing. I guess this sort of childhood fantasy came true when I volunteered to join the United States Marine Corps." He became a veteran against the war. Most of the boys and girls who join up numbered their options on the fingers of one hand with fingers to spare. The only stories they had to tell about their lives before they joined the military were painfully circumscribed, and most were a version of the basic scenario I already knew. My family was poor, I was poor. For the poor, immigrants, Hispanics, Asians, Native Americans, African Americans, and whites alike. The military often offers what looks like the only way up and out. A white girl in Pennsylvania, just finishing high school, dreamed of college, not soldiering, but she didn't know how to apply. Her parents couldn't help her, and she felt too ashamed to ask her teachers. A military recruiter who haunted her high school told her she had the makings of a Marine. I knew the Marines were really tough, she says, and I wanted to be part of that club of really tough people. I guess I was kind of angry that I couldn't go to college like I wanted. She's also a member of Veterans Against the War. A black girl in South Carolina finished near the top of her high school class. Determined not to repeat her mother's life, she enrolled in a state college. To attend, she had to rent a room in the college town and get a job at Walmart to pay for it. There was no public bus, so she needed a car to travel to her job. She couldn't break even, but somehow, with help from her mom, she managed this arrangement for 2 years before the hard work wore her out and she began to talk to the Army recruiters who hung around the mall. She told me her story when we met on a firing range in Afghanistan. She was homesick. In Boston, at a predominantly black high school, a senior who had already signed up for the Army, he was in junior ROTC that now infects our high schools, told me he wanted to escape the violence of city streets. I got no future here, he said. I might as well be in Afghanistan. Only a few weeks before he joined, one of his best friends had been killed in a convenience store just down the block from the school, caught in the crossfire of somebody else's fight. His chances of survival, he was convinced, would be better in Afghanistan than in his own neighborhood. He said, I gotta finish high school before I can go. I just hope I can make it to the war. There's something wrong with that picture. I should say that before I wrote this book, whoops, I had written a series of feminist books, mostly about violence against women. Excuse my chug-a-lug. And after 9/11, I went to Afghanistan in 2002 to work with women there because they had been, great numbers of them had suffered tremendous abuse and physical torture, sexual torture during the Soviet occupation and during the Taliban regime, and now they'd been bombed by the Americans. And so I worked on violence against women with Afghan women, and of course worked with a lot of Afghan men as well on the civilian side for 8 years before I ever embedded with American troops in that country. And I hasten to say that in Afghanistan, it is certainly the civilians who have done most of the suffering in that war. It's always the civilians these days, and that means mainly the ones who can't run away. The children, the elderly people, the sick, the disabled, and the women who stay behind to care for those people, who are the principal victims. But when I then embedded with the Americans in 2010 to go see what was happening to American women troops, I found myself on forward bases with half a dozen to a dozen women on any base and amid hundreds of men. And that's when I began to see the dead and the wounded disappearing, and saw that there was a story there that I wanted to follow. I also should say that I, on the basis of my experience with Afghan culture, when I went to the American military bases, I certainly knew more about Afghanistan than anyone on those bases. And the ignorance of even the commanding officers about the nature of the country in which they were engaged in fighting, and exactly who the enemy was and how they were creating new enemies every day. Perhaps it's kinder to say the innocence of our military, of what they were up to, was quite staggering. And also the civilians who had been sent along to win the hearts and minds of the Afghan people. We won't even go into that. So on these bases, as I saw these patrols coming back, missing people, and often then communications would shut down and the dead or the wounded would be taken away from the field in a medevac helicopter, taken off to a field surgical station and then to Bagram Hospital, which was the best equipped level 3 trauma hospital in Afghanistan and was really the express lane for the wounded to come home. Often the squad that they had left wouldn't know what had happened to them for days or weeks, or in some cases they wouldn't find out at all. But you know that we still, all through these wars, we've seen these happy stories in the media of soldiers who've had their legs blown off, but gee whiz, now they've got these great titanium legs, and the next thing we know, they're participating in the Paralympics hockey games in Sochi. Isn't that great? So I thought there was a story in between there, and I thought that maybe not all of the wounded were actually going to wind up in the Paralympics. So that was the story I wanted to follow, and it took me a year to get permission to do it, to embed with the medevac people, and then I had to have a military minder. It was like the old days being a journalist in the Soviet Union when you had a KGB guy assigned to you, and he went along to all your interviews to remind the people you were talking to that they better not actually say anything. Luckily, my minder was a really big soldier, and he ate a lot and slept really a lot. He could fall asleep like that, and so pretty much I was on my own. And we followed the path then, as I described, from the field to Bagram. And what happens there is that instantly these critically injured soldiers, catastrophically injured soldiers, are treated, and the effort always is to move them on to the next level of treatment within a day, if possible, 3 days at the most. And instantly the surgeries start with the physically injured soldiers. Many double, triple, and quadruple amputees coming out of these wars, and also the part we hear much less about, the extensive genital damage to thousands of these soldiers who step on IEDs. So these it's mostly guys in the infantry, have these catastrophic injuries. They're moved then from Bagram, once they're stabilized, in cargo planes with other soldiers less seriously injured, under the care of a 3-person team, critical care team, and flown to Landstuhl Regional Medical Center in Germany, which is the largest American hospital outside the United States and is the next level up in trauma care. And there, this whole process starts all over again, working to combat infection and necrosis in these catastrophic wounds, stabilize the soldiers, and get them on the next cargo flight out, medevac cargo flight out to Dover Air Base in Delaware, and from there they're transferred by truck ambulances to Walter Reed Hospital, which used to be in Washington, now is consolidated with Bethesda Naval Hospital in Bethesda. So that's where they go. So it's an amazing an amazing system that sends these soldiers through. And most of the critical soldiers, of course, were unconscious, intubated during this whole thing. The doctors don't meet them. You know, the doctors are just busy carving them up and trying to patch them back together. And so on these bases, I talked principally to the medical personnel, to the doctors and nurses. Most of them career military, most of them in their 30s, 40s, been working as orthopedic surgeons, urological surgeons, neurological surgeons in military hospitals in this country and other American bases. And none of them had ever seen or even imagined the catastrophic injuries of the soldiers they were seeing in those hospitals. And I can tell you that every one of them, they're there on 6 months tours, and they're struggling to keep it together, to keep up their own spirits and to keep up the spirits of their team. But every one of them, once that door shut and they were alone with me in a room, broke down. They were all just on the edge trying to cope with what they were seeing and what they were required to do. So, and they do great work. They save great lives. They save lives, but they're constantly plagued when they're working on these amputees and people with catastrophic internal damage, young men who have lost their genitalia. They're constantly wondering, are these people, when they get to Walter Reed and they wake up and they find out what's happened to them, are they really going to be glad to be alive? They didn't have an answer for that question. Once we followed that route all the way through, I also talk about in this book the rehab facilities for those amputees at Walter Reed, and that is a story of extraordinary courage and bravery of these guys trying to make their bodies, what's left of their bodies, work for them again. So that rehab, and then I also talk about this issue of PTSD, and since it's very misunderstood, I try to give a short little history of how it came to be in the psychiatric manuals and how it came to be a frequent diagnosis and what exactly that diagnosis means. It generally means some guidelines to follow for trying to help the person who has PTSD. But as I learned from traveling around to various VAs in the country, including in this area, and talked to therapists of all different backgrounds and experience, there's widespread differing opinion on just exactly what needs to be done for these people and how it should be done and what protocols should be used. And so it's a long story, short in my book, and I hope it will give you a little bit more of an understanding of that word, which is now thrown around very loosely, or that acronym, thrown around very loosely without much understanding of what it means. And also, I talk about something with which it's often confused, and that is traumatic brain injury, which is a real structural injury to the brain, and there are thousands of soldiers suffering from that. The last estimates I've seen are from 2 years ago that say that close to 700,000 returned veterans suffer from psychological or traumatic brain injuries. The figure is undoubtedly higher. These are always undercounts. Then I also followed home, not these particular individual soldiers. I don't trace any one soldier's story all the way through this book because I came to see the soldiers the way the Pentagon sees them, as interchangeable parts in the great American war-making machine. So I'm telling you about the process of treating them. It's like a factory. But I did go to the homes of soldiers who had been returned to home apparently in good shape, but who later took their own lives. And of course, soldiers are doing that, they say now at the rate of 22 per day. That again is also an underestimate because the Pentagon doesn't count the suicides of those who have already left the service when they take their lives. And nor has anyone kept track of what seems to be, on the basis of anecdotal evidence, widespread suicides among the family members of returning veterans. And we also now know of some cases of wives of returning servicemen who have killed not only themselves, that is, the woman has taken her own life, but she has taken her own children with her. So more instances of a single wound spreading to many others. And something else I talk about in this book that perhaps you don't know about because it's been kind of a secret. It's now even an official secret, but I'll tell you, because it should be a national scandal, and that is the implication in these suicides of the overprescription by private doctors and by the Veterans Administration of opioid painkillers. And do you know about this? Even before 9/11, the pharmaceutical companies, the big pharma guys, had started producing these opioid painkillers, and they set up 8 or 10 scientific research pain foundations. They all have fancy names, and they were all staffed by psychiatrists and doctors who were all funded by, guess who, the pharmaceutical companies. And they were funded to write papers, give public talks, like this one, write op-eds, and testify before Congress and lobby the VA to purchase these opioid painkillers and use them on their patients. At that time, the VA hospitals were full of veterans, aging veterans of Vietnam, and they were in pain. So the VA was a bit hesitant, but the pain foundations lobbied the Congress, and happily the big pharma companies donated to the re-election campaigns of many of our Congress people, so that Congress passed a law that requires the VA to administer these opioid painkillers to returning vets who are in pain. And I challenge you to find a returning vet who doesn't have some kind of physical and mental pain. So now these are, thanks to journalists at the newspaper in Austin, Texas, who've researched the deaths of returning veterans in their state. These are heavily implicated in suicides. They were originally advertised by the pain foundations and big pharma as being magical drugs without any side effects. We now know that they are highly addictive, particularly in young people. 2 years ago, about 2 years ago, there was so much pressure on Congress to do something about this that the Senate Finance Committee started an investigation of the seemingly improper relationship between the big pharmaceutical companies and the drug the pain foundations, the scientific foundations. Those scientific foundations immediately shut down, and they closed up shop, and the doctors went on to bigger and better things, some of them in the VA. And now that this is officially under investigation by the Senate Finance Committee, we can't talk about it anymore. Meanwhile, the drugs continue to be prescribed and our veterans continue to die. And to me, there's a really tragic irony in the notion of soldiers who were sent to Afghanistan to destroy farmers' poppy crops coming back to be given synthetic derivatives of poppy crops by their own Veterans Administration and taking their own lives or dying of overdoses as a result. It's a terrible scorecard. So, oh, and then I haven't even mentioned for the private military contractors. That's another whole bunch of people, more than our soldiers, because in every war zone, the private contractors outnumber the soldiers. And they are exposed to many of the same hazards, and many of them are ex-military already. And they tend to be the ex-military guys who not only didn't fit in when they came home, but who really loved being at war. That's how far gone they were. And so they go back for the money and the fun. And then after a while, they come home. And they don't have a VA. They don't have any therapists. They are just here on the loose. Many of them going to work for, guess what? The Border Patrol. And you perhaps didn't know that the Border Patrol now occupies a 100-mile zone on all United States borders. That means we have this. It's too scary even to go there. So a few things to think about. And then also we need to say that the care of these veterans who come home, even those who do get assistance from the VA, and by no means all suffering veterans do get assistance, but the real care of them, and for a great many, thousands upon thousands, it's going to be lifelong care, is in the hands of women. It's their mothers, their moms, and their wives expected to take care of them for the rest of their lives. And in many cases, those women in the families who assume the care of these vets are women who had very responsible jobs in their own communities that they've had to give up. For example, there's a woman in my book who's been taking care of her son, who's a veteran of Iraq for, well, since 2004, 10 years now, and she was, before she had to quit to take care of her son, she was the director of the therapeutic and educational programs for at-risk youth in her urban high school system, and they couldn't replace her. So there's something that's going to reverberate throughout that big community. So anyway, all these stories make for a book that's not going to make you feel good, and that is its purpose. I have an agenda, so I want to read you one little bit more before I let you ask some questions. Sooner or later, almost every American soldier comes home, on a stretcher, in a box, in an altered state of mind. Soldiers return or fail to return to families who love them or try to, families who recognize them or not, communities that help them or can't. That's what this book is about, not the pointless wars, which have gone on for so long that historians are already weighing in with their evaluations, using words like shipwreck, disaster, tragic mistake. Historian Andrew J. Basovich reminds us it is the soldier who bears the burden of such folly. U.S. troops in battle dress and body armor, whom Americans profess to admire and support, pay the price. In this book, I don't pretend to give anything like a complete picture of soldiers, but rather offer a series of snapshots of soldiers I met and the people around them, the caregivers and family members and friends who look after them when things don't go according to plan. They, too, pay the price of folly. I gathered these snapshots on military bases and in military hospitals in the United States and its war zones and in houses here at home. They are not pretty pictures. They are what I saw, perhaps darkened by the knowledge that nothing recorded in this book had to happen. War is not natural. We have to be trained for it, soldiers and citizens alike. And the wars of choice we were trained for, the wars these soldiers took part in, need never have been fought. Contrary to common opinion in the United States, war is not inevitable, nor has it always been with us. War is a human invention, an organized, deliberate action of an antisocial kind, and in the long span of human life on Earth, a fairly recent one. For more than 99% of the time that humans have lived on this planet, most of them have never made war. What's more, war is obsolete. Most nations don't make war anymore, except when coerced by the United States to join some spurious coalition. The Earth is so small, and our time here so short. No other nation on the planet makes war as often, as long, as forcefully, as expensively, as destructively, as wastefully, as senselessly, or as unsuccessfully as the United States. No other nation makes war its business. And on that issue of war as business, I just want to add that it is a very efficient business. It's the business that Eisenhower warned us about so long ago, that military, industrial, congressional complex, thank you, coalition, I almost said, that has now come to fruition. And nobody knows better than you in Seattle, who have major arms manufacturers and a major base right here in your neighborhood. And that is the situation now in all 50 states. They all have military bases and military armaments manufacturers and congressional representatives who can't vote to cut into any of that. So this is a gigantic machine now, and it is one of the most efficient engines, probably the most efficient, for transferring money from the public treasury, which should be for the good of us all, upwards into the pockets of the already rich war profiteers who are running the show. Which means that if you read this book and it makes you angry or it makes you sad, then you have your assignment. You have to get busy. No cheap grace for you, no just waving a flag or getting your heart warmed by seeing a soldier in the Olympics on his titanium legs. None of that for you. You have to get busy and work to end war. And a big part of that is probably what we're going to hear about later from your city councilwoman, and that is restoring economic justice, because it's clearly in the interest of those war profiteers that we keep those young people without any options at the bottom of the heap, to keep refilling the slots left empty in our standing army by the wounded and the dead. So economic justice, and an end to war. That's your assignment. Thank you very much. Do you have questions?
Like, does it affect, if people are introduced to trauma or encounter trauma when they're 35, is it a different outcome than when you're 19?
I don't know about research on that, but there's certainly the 19-year-old brain is not yet fully developed. And the 19-year-old soldier has also had to go through the traumatic experience of basic training. So it goes to the war zone already, traumatized. But one important thing I would say about age difference is that we have been trained by psychology and particularly traditional psychoanalysis and psychiatry to think that we are shaped by our childhood experiences, and we have many prescribed treatments for traumatized people, that traumatized veterans that don't talk about the war but take them back to their childhood experiences, as though that is where the trauma comes from. But it's clear that a person can be traumatized at any age and their character and behavior altered in dramatic ways by that experience. Yes, in the back?
Thank you so much for your work. I used to go to Iraq and watch the trauma there, the sanctions period, and that was terrible also on the part of the Iraqis. My question is, are you familiar with the project that's going to go live in September, in the week of World Peace Day, to abolish all wars? Not this one or that one, but abolish wars. And if you are, could you speak of it? If not, could you allow me to speak of it?
Please go ahead. Would you like to use this?
Can people hear me okay? Shall I stand up?
Stand up.
They're very, very credible people. David Hartsoe, David Swanson, and others who have put together a project. And the website is worldbeyondwar.org. I'll repeat it again in just a second. But if you think that's a pipe dream and an impossible one, think about how the world looked at slavery in 1785, when 10 people got together in a small room in London to decide to end slavery. And they did within 35 years or so without a war. Well, these people believe maybe now is the time to do it with war. So I encourage everyone to go to that website, worldbeyondwar.org. And see me after if you want a couple more links and important ones. But World Beyond War is the place to sign up and take part in this, because it's the most exciting activist action going on that I'm aware of.
Yes, thank you very much. Worldbeyondwar.com. David Swanson was the leader behind this, but it's a great group of people and growing all the time. There's plenty for you to get involved with there, all sorts of committees. Stopping war is not something you do by waving a flag. It takes long, hard organization, as these Veterans for Peace out here know. So.
I'm sorry, I think it's .org.
.org, sorry. Thank you for correcting me. Worldbeyondwar.org. Other questions? Yes.
If I may, I'd like to make a comment that I think is appropriate.
Yes.
I work for the Veterans Administration, and I'm in an office where we're doing claims. The majority of what we do in my office, which is a branch of a regional office in Seattle, is every Army veteran that's being discharged now is coming to my office for a review of his file to get the process started for claims for disability. So in the process of my day, I read a lot of correspondence, I see a lot of medical records, and I'm a 31-year veteran of the Coast Guard and the Navy. I never saw combat, but I weep. I can't help myself. But here's what I want to say. I want to give a number. 1,176,000. That's how many claims my peers and myself processed in the last fiscal year. Let me repeat, 1,176,000. Most claims have as many as 8 or more complaints, all of which have to be medically reviewed and put through the process of evaluation. We are on mandatory overtime. We are fully funded. The shutdown of the government did not affect us. We kept working at full tilt. So all I want to say, you are the stakeholders, you are the taxpayers, you are supporting this huge thing. 331,000 employees in the Veterans Administration and all of the different things that we do. Now, all I can say we're doing our best to try to get the benefit out there. But like anything else, we are going to be continually hamstringed by our own regulation, and I'll leave you with this thought. The traumatic brain injury you've discussed very well, the idea of PTSD. This is a ticking time bomb. You've made that quite clear. The first thing I did 4 years ago when I came into the Veterans Administration as an employee was Agent Orange claims of Vietnam-era veterans, because so many of them had been denied any kind of benefit because they could not show a connection between their service and the fact that they had been exposed egregiously to dioxins and other things in the field. So some $4 billion later, and almost 200,000 re-adjudicated claims later, most of them to heirs because the veterans had passed away of leukemia, Parkinson's disease, and all these other things that latently happened after their service time, of course. I see this in the future, as you've described, beyond any budget, beyond any means to come up with the mechanisms of treatment, care, and funding. And yet we continue, as you so well said, to get involved in these pointless little things in places like the Sandbox. And recent things have said as many as your own writing, 1/3 of all veterans coming back are going to be stricken with PTSD, if not traumatic brain injury. But I just want to, again, make the point, I'm not taking a hero's laurels myself. I'm simply saying, the Veterans Administration, I hope you can take pride in what we're trying to do to put right this situation that we're very limited, as great of a pace as we're operating. Thank you.
Thank you for making that comment, and at the same time, I have to add to what you have said, that my book is full of people who couldn't get treatment from the VA because the VA is so overloaded. The VA was already filled chock-a-block before the veterans of these wars even started coming home, and it's been playing catch-up ever since, and it has not caught up, and it will never catch up at the rate this country goes. Is there one more question? Or I think we're about to shut down. A quick remark?
Oh, it's a question actually, but I will not be offended if you don't want to answer. If there was a way to quantify the suffering on the American side, let's say Latin, for example, how much suffering would be on the Afghan side and on the Iraqi side?
You can't quantify suffering.
Yeah.
No.
Like even
Yes,
a ratio kind of.
I'm not going to compare suffering, because on both sides, in Afghanistan, as I mentioned, there are far more civilian casualties, and there have been all along. And this is true in every war. But human suffering is human suffering. And the point is not which side suffers more than the other, but rather what can we do to stop this suffering? It is all so pointless and needless, and consumes our resources that we need for other things. Let me give you one last paragraph to sum this up. This book is not about war itself, nor even about soldiers, as they are trained to see themselves, and we, in turn, are taught to see and support them. It is about the damage done to soldiers, their families, their communities, and the rest of us, who, for another half century at least, will pay for their care, their artificial limbs, their medications, their benefits, their funerals, and the havoc they dutifully wrought under orders around the world. Thank you very much.
Well, I was 18 and change when the telephone rang, calling me to report to the sea. Vietnam War raged on every front page of the country. So I sailed to the war, a faraway shore, with boys no wiser than I. Too young to vote, hoping too young to die. Serving time for the crime of being born American male, where sons become brothers in arms or brothers in jail. Or perhaps it was love or self-prescribed drugs, or the limbo of lost out at sea, sailing that line between reason and rhyme, Frank, Dennis, and me. Oh, I recall the resorts and all the opium ports, but truth shines later in life, and the plight of the pawn, it pales in the light of the king. How convenient is the God who would spare not the rod and send his only child to die, when in the hands of a power intent on only saving a life. I turned 21 years old, coming home from the South China Sea, slapping paint on the rust of the sinking American dream. And did the home fires burn for the hero's return? Was a red carpet rolled to the sea? Where was the parade when democracy was saved by Frank, Dennis, and me? Now I can see in my son where he'd march to the gun, how his soul would wither and die. I know how that goes, far too long it's been happening to mine. May the damage done me by the powers that be never be done unto mine, and may the criminals and foes be exposed by history and time. For Dennis and I swore that the Vietnam War will have ended at the moment when honor prevails with justice demanded. And as the names on the wall of the Washington Mall await the dead to return from the sea, those veterans still dying a day at a time, Frank, Dennis, and me. For Dennis and I swore that the Vietnam War will have ended at the moment when honor prevails with justice demanded. And as the names on the wall of the Washington Mall await the dead to return from the sea, those veterans still dying a day at a time with Frank, Dennis, and me. When Johnny comes marching home again, when Johnny comes marching home again, when Johnny comes marching home again, we'll all go out and welcome him. Never mind the shape he's in. And we'll ask him how the fighting went. We'll ask him how the fighting went. We'll ask him how the fighting went and how he likes the president. Casualties are an accident. And we'll beat our drums and wave our flags. We'll beat our drums and wave our flags. We'll beat our drums and wave our flags with great and grand and glorious rags, the ones they put on the body bags. And later on when the sickness comes, later on when the sickness comes, later on when the sickness comes from chemicals and uranium, we'll wring our hands and we'll all play dumb. See the old veterans who did their part, the veterans who did their part. See the veterans who did their part and came back home with a Purple Heart, walking around with a shopping cart. See where all the legs that used to run, where all the legs that used to run, where all the legs that used to run before you went to carry a gun. Well, I'm afraid your dancing days are done. You have no arm, you have no leg. You have no arm, you have no leg. You have no arm, you have no leg. You're an armless, legless, chickenless egg. They'll have to put you out with a bowl to beg.